I went to grad school at UVA. So, in fact, I had a carol in First Methodist Church
Oh,
when I was a
wow.
grad student. And I loved the Virginian. I don't know if it's still there. I mean,
Yeah.
we didn't have a lot of money to eat out, but I loved that place. And yeah, some of them, I had some great professors, James Childress and David
Oh,
Little,
yeah.
and
Yeah.
a
Wow.
philosopher named John Simmons, who was just, they were all just remarkable. Gerald Fogarty, who was a Catholic
Oh, I love,
historian.
yeah, I
So
loved him
anyway,
too.
great people. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Well, we're obviously already rolling into this with somebody who has a great affection for Charlottesville, and I feel that every time I talk to him. This is the Whole City podcast for Charlottesville First United Methodist Church, and today I've got Bishop Ken Carter here with us to talk, and really have looked forward to this conversation. You and I have had some opportunity to work together in the past
Right,
on a couple of different projects,
right.
and now you've worked on a project about first churches, and that pulled me back into thinking it
Yeah.
was time to get to a conversation with you. So thanks for being here. Just
Thank you.
so I'll give a short bio, and then you can share anything else that you'd like to. But so Ken Carter is the resident bishop of the Western North Carolina Conference since January the 1st. He's kind of coming back home after 10 years as the resident bishop in the Florida Conference. Um, and long list of things. He was president of the Council of Bishops from 2018 to 2020, a moderator of the Commission on the Way Forward, which was pivotal in trying to bring the denomination together. On the consulting faculty at Duke Kennedy School. What else? What else would you say about yourself, Ken?
That's good. I'm married. My wife is an elder in the church. Just has done a lot of work in Haiti. Was in the earthquake in Haiti, and we have two daughters. One teaches Chinese at Vassar College in New York, and one is communication director of communications at the University of Tennessee Dental School and Health Sciences in Memphis. Two granddaughters, so and their husbands. So that's all. That's us. So yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and I know you got a number of degrees from some lesser institutions, but what was your degree from UVA, and when were you here for that?
I was there in I think that's a great question, the mid to late 80s, and I finished a master's degree. I was in a PhD program, and I think I just ran out of academic steam
That's
and
exactly what
wanted
I did.
and wanted to kind of get back into the parish. That was so, but I loved UVA. I was in the religious ethics program, so I had a lot of religious ethics and philosophy, and I think it just helped me to think as I look
Hmm.
back. And I wanted to get closure on it, so had some exceptional teachers. I love that area of where UVA is, where First United Methodist Church is. So it brings back great memories. And my wife
Yeah,
during that time was the educator at Peakland United Methodist Church in Lynchburg.
in
So,
Lynchburg,
and
commuting down to Lynchburg. Yeah,
yeah, she loved that church. So we kind of lived in between and commuted each way. Yeah.
how about that? Wow. Yeah, so I had a very similar experience. I went to UVA to get a PhD and ended up just taking a master's too. So I guess
Yeah.
UVA is where PhD dreams go to die. So,
That's right. That's
for
right.
some.
That's right. That's right.
Well,
Yeah.
so you've just written this article with Audrey Warren, pastor at First United Methodist in Miami, Florida, about what happens when an old first church needs to change. And
Right.
I know you led a workshop that a couple of our members were part of online with Audrey in the last year. And so I wonder what is as you see it, and you worked with a lot of First United Methodist churches in a lot of different places. What's the kind of legacy of
Yeah.
first churches around the country?
Yeah. Well, thanks, Alex, and thanks, Robert. It really was the confluence of a couple of things. One was, so I'll start with one side of it. during the pandemic, we were all just doing different things and reacquainting ourselves with things we rediscovered since we had the time to do that and were disrupted. And I came across a book called What's Ahead for Old First Church. And it was written in 1973. Now, I went to the Duke Divinity School in the early 80s. So that one of the authors was Robert Wilson. He was one of my professors. He was a person who really researched local churches. I mean, not the idea of church, but real people, real buildings, real locations, and was just a good friend, was the kind of person I'd see whenever I went back. And I recalled a conversation where I was in a downtown church and we were struggling. And he talked about that book. This would have been in the mid 80s, late 80s. He talked about the book, What's Ahead for Old First Church. He said, that book just sold and sold and sold. So I was looking at it, so I reread it. And obviously, we were in the middle of a pandemic. We were not in our buildings, most of us. And one of the striking realities of the book was first churches were in decline when that book was written in the early 70s. That was a revelation to me because we all have a kind of a nostalgia that, 50 years ago, those must have been the glory years, but they were not. Yeah. And so I began reading it, and it talks a lot about the qualities of first churches. They often want to do things with excellence. They have a disproportionate number of people who do what I call the heavy social lifting in communities, people who are school principals, hospital administrators, city council people, sometimes mayors, judges, those sorts of things. That's just been my experience. They are often in these churches. And so that was a part of it. The other part was having been a bishop, serving at the time in Florida. We had a church, First Miami, and actually Cynthia Weems was the pastor when I got there. And she's a superb minister. And then I asked her to be the superintendent in Miami in that area. And we appointed Audrey Warren there. And they're friends and work very closely together. So they had this kind of sequence of two really effective kind of visionary ministers. So First Miami was not in a crisis, but they clearly needed to think about their future in a different way in terms of their property. Now, they are diagonally across from where the Miami Heat play. So that's where they are on Key Biscayne Boulevard in Miami. And so Audrey and Cynthia's the DS, and the conference will do a several-year process of revisioning the church's really mission and property. Now, the architect's children were in the church, so they had a lot of stake in the past, but they were led to a new future. And so it wasn't just theory for me, this book, it was also this particular church. And then I began looking around at other churches. We had a church, First Tampa, that closed, and Hyde Park, which was a strong church near it, helped it to reconfigure itself toward really a ministry with the homeless and centering prayer and training people for jobs and a coffee kind of restaurant. And so I began to really see first churches, and I have a real appreciation for first churches. We could also talk, they're very different. I mean, Alex, you would know this. We kind of lived through the 90s and the aughts of the kind of the big box church on the edge of town, which everyone was enamored with. And many of those churches have entered into kind of crisis, and this is in the culture in terms of the succession of their leaders. So that's some of the background of first churches. Yeah.
Right. And so if you could just briefly describe what happened to First Church Miami, because they did a radical thing with their building and their space.
They did, and Audrey and I have written one piece for Faith and Leadership, and actually there will be a second. It was envisioned as a two-part series. So they decided not to leave downtown Miami, and had they made that decision, um, there would have been an infinite financial transaction for the property. And so they did really, they did to me, a very compelling thing. They decided to stay, and really in that they're in the minority of the mainline churches in that part of Miami to remain. And they took their building down to the ground and entered into a public-private partnership with a corporation. And they had really good guidance in this. And when churches do this, we need good guidance because it's not a level playing field in terms of corporate real estate. And they have built, and so for the about 3 years this took, they worshiped in an AME church, which was great. Okay. Just a great partnership. And I preached in that church. It was Greater Bethel AME in Miami. And now they are moving into the facility. It's 40 stories, and 32 are for the corporation for tenants. And it's what they call attainable housing, which is attainable means, and I don't know the exact meaning of the technical term, but it's really housing for people who do the work in a place like Miami. So people who are the x-ray technicians and nurses and school teachers. And had they not done that, had it just been for the market in a place like that, a lot of people would have purchased those but never lived there. They would have been people from places like Venezuela and Russia, just putting money into a space that's going to appreciate. And so the 8 stories are for the church, and that's space for worship. It's space. There's a rock climbing wall and a basketball gym on one of the floors. There's educational space. There's gathering space on the main level. There's a chapel where people can just come and pray. And so it's really been an extraordinary long-term journey. The church actually has grown and gotten younger and gotten more inclusive. It really reflects more of what the area is. And so it also provides a revenue stream for the church. And that's really important because Miami is a very transient place in terms of the people who come and live there for a while and then move on. So they're working with a lot of those variables, and really Dr. Audrey Warren has given extraordinary leadership to that community.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that I immediately thought of in reading that article is, and just in sensing myself what it takes to make those kind of transformations is, where do you find the leaders to do this kind of thing? Right. Clergy and lay who can think in these different ways. I mean, we weren't trained as entrepreneurs going through seminary.
Right.
Did you see a developing network of such people?
I do think that once we got involved with that, I began to see this happening in different places around the country, and they don't all look the same. So Atlanta, Georgia, where Jasmine Smothers is, at First Atlanta, a very similar model, but I think more affordable housing. More of an orientation toward affordable housing. There's a place called Haywood Street in Asheville, North Carolina, which was a church that was next to the Central Methodist, and it closed. It was the old Haywood Street Church, and it has just an extraordinary number of ministries within it, including a hospice and a weekly worship service, and really what looks like a high-end restaurant, although it's a free meal. but Brian Combs is the pastor, and you begin to see churches that have repurposed, and I think seen their buildings not as albatrosses, but as assets,
Right.
and to try to be a part of sort of what someone called the public square, to
Yeah.
try to keep faith and practice, spiritual practice there. One of the themes that emerged for me in reading What's Ahead for Old First Church was connecting it to something Gil Rendell talks about in his book Quietly or Quiet Courage, about nostalgia.
Yeah.
And first churches have a strong nostalgia. I mean, you're in a very historical place where you all are. And nostalgia can be a temptation that gets in the way of being present in the
Yeah.
moment. And so first churches often have really glorious histories and strong histories, and there are artifacts. We talk about this in some of our writing. They have artifacts of all the pictures of the former ministers, and history rooms, and this great thing happened here in this church. For Greater Bethel, it was that Martin Luther King Jr., Dr. King, had preached there. And so we have a memory about the past. Our memories are not always accurate,
Right.
or truthful. And so it's how do we value the past? And it's not about destroying the past, but it's about being faithful. And so one of the things Audrey talks about, and we talk about in that article, is, most first churches were started by really pioneering people, really, really innovative people. So how to recapture the spirit of that innovation and value the tradition. Another image we talk about in the book we wrote on Fresh Expressions, one of them is the church is a temple, the church is a tent, the church is a museum. That's one of the images. And so museum can seem very calcified, but think about the best museums you've been to in the United States. I mean, they have a treasure, but they're innovative in the way they share it, the way they communicate it. Civil rights museums, Holocaust museum, how museums bring in children and youth and into their stories. And so sometimes we think of a museum, well, it's just encasing the past, but really the most powerful museums really bring people into the present, bring the past into the present. And I think that's something we're struggling with.
Yeah, I feel that especially here, this building that we're in right now will turn 100 years old next year. It was built at the same period in the same year as the park across the street where the Unite the Right rally happened a few years ago. And
right.
So, and we have one of the things you note in the article is how that a lot of first churches are dealing with the legacy of systemic racism as well, and that's certainly the case here. That every period of new building in Charlottesville seems to have involved some level of displacement of particularly the African American community. So it's trying to retell a different kind of story. And recognize the great history that's there too. So
right.
And I'm sure as you were telling that story about the church in Miami leveling the building to create something something much different, I was getting the image of, okay, what if this steeple that I'm under right now where to go? It would be a huge change. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and the first Miami was itself the merger of two churches that preceded it. One was a northern church, one was a southern church.
Yeah.
And many of our churches, once we peel back the layers, have those histories. Sometimes a church when we talk about first churches, sometimes they're named after saints or they're central or something like that, but they sometimes have blended legacies.
Hmm.
And I think the reckoning with racism, I mean, certainly a place like the University of Virginia, we were talking earlier, I have a degree from the
Yeah.
University of Virginia, so I have one of those really large diplomas, that
Yeah. Yeah. That's it
are
right there.
yeah, that's
Right
it.
behind me.
And
Uh,
so it has both a tradition of reason and enlightenment and equality, but integral to that also is a history of enslaving persons,
mhm.
and and patriarchy, and and so that's all a part of it. In the same way, our denomination does, with its history of the central jurisdiction and the cost of the quote merger.
Mhm.
And I was my lineage as a elder. One bishop was Bishop L. Scott Allen, the last bishop elected in the central jurisdiction, ordained me
Mm.
deacon, and Bishop L. Bevel Jones ordained me elder, and his lineage went through the tradition of the enslaving person and why the
Mm.
church broke apart. And I think reckoning with our past and the complexity of it and finding ways to move toward equity is kind of our challenge. And I think repurposing buildings is a part of that.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
communities.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you've been very active in the fresh expressions movement, and
Mm-hmm.
I know one of the books that you just mentioned was "Fresh Expressions of People Over Property,"
Yep.
that you and Audrey had put together. Um, what, fresh expressions are getting a lot of traction these days. People are talking about how they can transform affinity groups into something like
Yeah.
a new form of church, and usually when we think of them, we think of them as small, like maybe turning a book club into a fresh
Right.
expression, or
Uh-huh.
um, uh, at a tattoo
Right.
parlor, or wherever. Um, what Miami did was very big. I mean, it was a much
It
bigger
was.
kind of fresh expression.
Right.
How um, how do you see that fitting into that fresh expressions model, and how do what helps a congregation get a vision for something
Yeah.
big like that?
Well, one of the things I love about the Fresh Expressions movement, I really encountered it in England. And just some of my own journey was, this goes back, say, 15 or so years, was our model of starting new churches was simply, you could call it unsustainable, you could call it a lot of things, but it was simply not a practice we could continue. The idea that we're going to find 250 young adults, they're going to form that size group, we're going to appoint a pastor to them, hope the pastor's not a sociopath, hope they
Uh-huh.
hope they stay together long enough to raise enough money to buy property and build a new building and stay together. It becomes the United Methodist Church. It begins to fund other things. Um, it's possible that that happens, but and I'm being humorous about the qualities of the pastor, but it did have the model of the heroic solo leader,
Hmm.
whose charisma would gather this group together, and it was doing a lot of harm. And the Fresh Expressions movement, when I began to learn about it, was really rooted in England, Church of England and British Methodist Church, was really not about property, but about really planting expressions of Christianity in the culture where people gather. And a part of it, and you'll remember this, a part of why it resonated also was we had this communication campaign, our hearts, our minds, our doors are always open.
Hmm.
And the assumption of that was that if people will come on our turf, they will
Yeah.
find us to be open-minded, open-hearted people. But the problem was people were not coming into our turf.
Yeah.
Some of that was our own self-inflicted wounds of malpractice and misconduct and harm that the church, how we excluded, singled out groups of people. Some of it was the culture, the way the culture defines Christianity. If you see a Christian on any kind of, popular culture, you don't want to be around them. They're likely to be someone you want to avoid, and that's just the way we're portrayed. And so it's a mix of all that and demographics. And so Fresh Expressions was to try to simply be present with people, to listen. There's a process to form communities in what's called third places, like coffee places, pubs, sports scenes, etc. And one of the things I loved about the Fresh Expressions movement, it took root in a very traditional church, is it does not disparage the tradition. I love tradition. In other words,
Yeah.
I love traditional worship. I love the traditional church. I want it to be a living tradition. But Fresh Expressions is not about saying we need to destroy tradition. They have this concept, mixed ecology or blended ecology. It's an ecosystem. We need inherited church and we need new expressions of church, and they can coexist. They can flourish together. And so First United Methodist in Miami, like a lot of churches, it does have some Fresh Expressions. It has yoga chapel, where they meet somewhere else, and they do a blend of yoga and praying the Psalms, just that kind of, and they've had people who've learned how to do that. In some other places, they also, I think, have a kind of it's not kayaking, but it's something like that, where they're kind of out on the water. They have, you've probably heard of dinner church. They have a brunch church where people gather in places that are not quite the church. And of course, digital space is a tremendously powerful third place. And third places came from a sociological term. The first two places are where I live and where I work. So my home or my apartment and my workplace. What's gotten all changed in the pandemic is how a lot of us now work where we live.
Yeah, our second place has become our first place, right?
That's right. And so we built, of course, these buildings for an attractional church.
Yeah.
We have parlors and history rooms and choir rooms and Sunday school rooms, and some people are doing some great work on repurposing some of those spaces, and housing is I would say the first churches I've worked with, and we've had a cohort of those this year in Western North Carolina. We'll have another one next year. The first churches I've worked with, when I talk about the book, that book written 50 years ago, it doesn't say anything about housing, affordable housing. So for Charlottesville, I would imagine housing's at a premium.
You'd be right.
In terms of how, and it's that way in Hendersonville, North Carolina. It's that way everywhere. And I mean, I've heard of churches that had searches for a youth minister in a county in Western North Carolina. They had a very good search process. They identified a person. In the end, the person could not afford to live anywhere near where that church was. The county manager told me that, who was a member of the church. And so how our property, how could that be a part of this? Because we do have a lot of assets. The Western North Carolina Conference, and this was through a Duke endowment study, has $3 billion worth of property. And that's not unusual. I would imagine the Virginia Conference is very similar.
Oh, yeah.
And so how do we repurpose some of this property for this?
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, well, it is a totally different way of thinking,
Mhm.
but it excites me to think about these kind
Yeah,
of
yeah,
things.
yeah.
It just
Mhm.
uh, I didn't get into this to maintain a parlor, so having some
Right,
new
right.
places to think about
Yeah,
and new
yeah.
outside spaces
Mhm. Right.
is exciting. And I
Mhm.
just want to mention he's been lurking in the background here, but Robert Lewis is on this podcast
Yeah.
with us, and Robert has been a pastor here in Charlottesville as well. So yeah, Robert, I don't know if you're thinking about anything and as all of this is going on, but if you know, feel free to jump in if you've got a got a thought.
Thanks.
Yeah,
Well, yeah, Bishop Carr, I served in England for 9 years in Sheffield, so
Oh, I've been to
that's
Sheffield.
right.
I was very much engaged in that fresh expressions development
Right.
period when you came across it. And one thing I remember from those days was that, in fact, the British Methodist Church kind of sponsored what they called pioneer ministers, and in essence, church planters, but for fresh expressions. Um, and what I remember from uh, district synods and the conference itself was one of the recurring conversations that came up was, at what point are they sustainable, and what can we
Mhm.
do to make them sustainable? And I think one of the things that I thought a lot about and discovered was that, in a sense, our existing churches were not sustainable. They happen to have inherited a lot of property, but
Right.
as a living, breathing entity, they were not sustaining themselves.
Right.
But that still, I mean, obviously salaries have to get paid, costs have to come
Mhm.
from somewhere.
Right.
And so I don't know that you have any answers for that, but I think one of the pressing challenges is how we do fund and support ministries that may not be successful. I think one of the things too um, that I'm sure you're aware of is that we have to be ready and able to take risks, and things don't always work. Uh,
Mhm.
and as I've been lurking in this congregation, it's with a history, and a congregation that's now part of First, that has tried for years and years to find that new path and develop affordable housing and et
Right.
cetera and et cetera, and we just couldn't make it happen.
Mhm.
And there, I think, is a real sense of failure and disappointment around that.
Mm.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, but we have to be able to make space for the places where it doesn't work either.
Mhm. Right.
In terms of having the freedom and the initiative to try. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about how we
Yeah.
encourage the trying
Mhm.
without
Yeah.
either you're booming First Miami or you failed and your church died.
Right. Right.
Mm.
And I don't think they would describe themselves as booming, but I think but it is a living, significant community that's contextual to its area. And I certainly resonate with everything you've said. I think a culture of experimentation is really important. That's something I've learned from design thinking. I know I was a part of some design thinking work with Bishop Sue Harper Johnson. Our two conferences worked on that for several years. And, design thinking is about experimentation and failure and learning and continuing the cycle. And so I think, the question of sustainability, it is creating multiple revenue streams for communities. That's a part of it. It is the conference investing in this. So, like in Western North Carolina, we're investing in 17 new communities this year, full-time clergy, um, and they are deacons, local pastors, elders in areas that have had disaffiliation to
Mm.
try to begin new communities. Now we're not expecting to build buildings. We're thinking some may be ecumenical partnerships, with other churches. Some may be simply gathering groups of persons, but But to me, an ecosystem, a conference as an ecosystem where every community doesn't look like every other one. And I think trying to invest at the local level and learn, and so I think a healthy conference, a healthy institution doesn't penalize what you've called failure. We've all failed in some ways. It is, what do I learn from this? And so I think, if we don't experiment, we're simply abandoning huge numbers of people to being outside of our witness. And a part of that is it's not that we are always taking God's grace to them. God's prevenient grace is already there, and it's how to be a part of that. I do think, to me, one of the best, healthiest facets of Fresh Expressions is it's not really investing in property, but we probably have enough property. It's really people, investing in people. And that's what you're saying about pioneers. And I do think that's something we're working on. And it is happening in some places, but it's not a rosy picture that everything is thriving. It's what we learn along the way, and take risks. Yeah.
And it's interesting to see the cycles of how this happens too, because that Hinton Avenue church that Robert is talking about could have been described in the 1890s as a fresh expression. As
right.
It was First Church seeking to start something new in the Belmont area, and so we've cycled back around to being together again, and looking at the next experiment. So.
Right.
You mentioned the disaffiliations. I wonder if you have, and I saw the bishops gathered back at the beginning of May, and we're talking about what this season has been like and how difficult it's been. I know you've had special annual conferences like we have, where we've seen a good number of churches leave. But Bishop Bickerton said, disaffiliation can't remain our work. And I wonder what makes you hopeful about the next stage, and what would you tell United Methodist to remain?
Right. Well, a part of my history was working with the Commission on the Way Forward and working with the Protocol with Kenneth Feinberg. And so both of those were groups of persons across this entire spectrum. So in other words, at the table were people who are now in leadership in the Global Methodist Church. And as I keep saying, they're not my enemies. I'm not here to disparage that. It's just a different vision of church. And so I would say, personally, I sometimes feel like I grieved a long time ago. Does that make sense? It's just that people had honest conversations with me and said, we are leaving. And this was many years ago. This was not this year. We are leaving. They said, when you preach about unity, you need to understand that we are already leaving. It's just taken a number of years to get there. And so the pivot, which Bishop Bickerton talks about, is it has to include the lament, the loss of friendships, relationships. It includes that. Sometimes buildings. I said something at our conference. We've grieved the loss of buildings, but not the loss of people. But we do have significant religious experiences in buildings. They mean something to us. And I have met lay people whose churches have disaffiliated. They've lost their church, and not in a clinical sense, but I can only say they have been traumatized. That's true. And so when we talk about pivot, I don't gloss over anything that's been hard. I think people are still mending, kind of healing from that. And that this short book I wrote on unrelenting grace is really about grace, connection, and holiness is our pathway to healing. And there's just a lot of brokenness, but the pivot is toward the next church. And I think it's going to be some of what we've already talked about. It's not about a name or a franchise or a term. It's just about how we adapt, to create new communities. We have a lot of talent. We have a lot of talented laity and clergy. We have an opportunity to really be in ministry with people we've done a lot of harm to. And I think in the book I mentioned what the harm we've done through racism and exclusion to me is staggering. And I think we have the opportunity to do this work and to be the church, and we're going to be a little smaller. And I think, but hopefully we will be clearer about our mission. And I think that's simply what we're in the middle of. I sometimes also think I could talk for several more minutes about what I think this is. Sometimes I think I won't really know what it is for 10 or 15 more years. We're just living in the midst of it. But I'm grateful for people all over the connection who are simply taking the next step. And I think that's really what we're in. And clearly with conferences that have 100, 150, 175 churches that disaffiliate at a time, they become a different entity. And so it's absorbing that, it's learning from that, it's adapting to that. And it is, what Robert was saying, it is asking the question, where do we channel our resources? And the urban-rural divide is a big part of this. The political division of our nation, a huge part of this. I know this from the letters I've gotten. So I'm not just speculating. People tell me this. And, we, in the Florida conference, we wrote a pretty strong statement after January 6th. And our cabinet worked on that. We had a very diverse cabinet. We struggled with that. There were people in our cabinet who really were wondering, is this saying too much? And there were others in the cabinet who were saying, our sin is that we don't say enough. And I remember Dr. Candace Lewis, who now the president of Gammon, who was a superintendent in that cabinet, saying, if we don't do this, we leave it for other people to do later. And I think, and so it's just a work in progress. And so I do believe we are on the way to a better church. That's not patting ourselves on the back. I think we're purging, and it's in all of us. It's not I've evolved, I'm telling other people what they need to do. It's all of our spiritual journey.
Oh, thanks. I sensed when we got together for the Virginia conference last week that it was a different conference. And it's not just because we have a new bishop. The disaffiliations have had an impact, and but there was a different spirit to the place, and so it felt like we were starting something new. With all of the uncertainty and the excitement that goes along with that.
Right.
Yeah. Well, my computer is telling me its battery is almost dead. And I didn't bring my charger to work today, so I can't do it. So I may drop out at any second, but and I know we've gone, to time anyway, but can I do a quick lightning round with you?
Yeah.
So our new bishop is someone you worked with quite often and in depth, Bishop Sue Halpert Johnson. What's the one thing we need to know about her?
She is a much more theologically orthodox person than people give her credit for.
Yeah.
That's not the stereotype about her.
Yeah. I just heard an interview that the Crackers and Grape Juice folks did with her, and it was evident.
And I'll say, when she was a superintendent, I asked her to serve in that way in my second year. It wasn't long before I thought I could give her my keys and my computer passwords, and she would do this work much better than me by the end of the day. And I've told her that. So yeah.
That's great. Well, she'll be here to preach in August. We're looking forward to that.
Yeah.
Twitter, you went off of it last fall. I missed you. Are you really gone for good?
You know, I did. I archived my Twitter thing, and I think I'm off of it. Yeah, I've learned to live without it. So yeah.
So baseball bag sizes. Is it a good thing or bad that they're bigger?
I like more activity, so I think it's good. People trying to steal more bases.
Yeah. I think the new rules have really helped.
Yeah.
And Ronald Acuna Jr., is he any good?
I think he's pretty good. And I would say this is the real heresy in my life. In Florida, I became a Rays fan as well as a Braves fan. And that's probably the people in my home of Georgia object to me the most, that, I sort of somehow, it's syncretism, that I'm somehow able to be a fan of the Braves and the Rays. But I love the way the Rays do it.
Yeah, they're well, my Rangers just finished the series with the Rays, and they got the better of them. The Rays got the better of the Rangers, so I saw that it's a relentless lineup. Wow. And best independent bookstore.
Best independent bookstore. Well, the best one, and this is, to me, is Powell's in Portland, Oregon, which I saw at the 2016 General Conference. It's like a city. It's like a city block.
Yeah.
But I would say I love. There's one, City Lights in Sylva, North Carolina, Regulator in Durham, North Carolina, Park Road in Charlotte, North Carolina. Several of those. Yeah.
You got a bunch in that. Yeah. Malaprops in Asheville.
Malaprops in Asheville.
That's
absolutely.
another great one.
Yeah.
Well, I really appreciate your spending some time with us today, Bishop. And
thank you, Alex and Robert.
Wish you every blessing in Western North Carolina, and come visit us sometime.
Thank you. I will. I'd love to. I will. Thank you, and blessings to you all. Yeah.
All right. Thanks.
Thank you.